We're so excited to welcome Erin Lawrimore as our guest speaker this afternoon. Erin currently serves as a university archivist and associate professor at UNCG. Erin has served as the university archivist in the Martha Blakeney Hodges Special Collections and University Archives since June 2011. She holds a BA in English from Duke University and a Master of Information Studies from the University of Texas at Austin School of Information. In her current role as university archivist, Erin manages acquisitions, processing, reference, and outreach for UNCG's institutional records of enduring value. Erin's research interests are widely varied, which include community-engaged archival practice, American Archives history and development, and the history of beer and brewing in North Carolina. Erin is a valued member of our UNCG community. She has served on various committees and always stands up for and represents our history and traditions with knowledge and pride. She is often called upon to provide context to complex decisions that may affect the future of our institution. Erin has been an integral part of our 50th alumni reunions, providing reunion classes with priceless artifacts that have been preserved since their graduation. It is always a pleasure to work with Erin, knowing that each time you meet with her, you will leave with a piece of knowledge and history that enriches us all. Erin, we are so glad to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thank you. Mary's going to make me cry before I even start talking.
All well meant, all meant.
Thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'm so excited that everyone is here. And I'm hoping that, this is a presentation that goes beyond the walls of UNCG, but also does include a lot of what we're doing here. I'm going to start by sharing my screen because I find pictures to be much more exciting to look at than me. So I'm going to start the presentation with some photos and incorporate some really fun photos that I found in my research that I hope you guys will enjoy too. But today I'm happy to talk about the topic, When the Computers Were Women. This is a talk that I actually first developed about 4 or 5 years ago for an event at the Honda Jet Corporation here in Greensboro. They actually reached out to me about talking at an alumni enrichment event. And this was around the time that the Hidden Figures movie first came out, the book and the movie. And here at UNCG, we actually had a little bit of story that was picked up in local NPR media and things like that about our connection to the women computers who were working for NASA and for NACA, which is the organization that existed prior to NASA. So, as we'll talk about in this presentation, UNCG has a very strong tie to the Human Computer Program. But first, before I delve into the UNCG specific part, or even honestly the NASA part, I want to give a little background about who were human computers, what does that mean, and why were they so vital to the development of engineering and spaceflight. We're going to start in the 19-teens, on the eve of World War I. This was a time of rapid cultural and technological change. In 1914, Robert Goddard began experiments in rocketry. That same year, the Panama Canal opened. 1 year later, Albert Einstein postulated his general theory of relativity, and Margaret Sanger was jailed as the author of Family Limitation, the first popular book about birth control. Frederick Winslow Taylor, the father of the book Scientific Management, passed away while his disciples, like Henry Ford, were applying his ideas to the process of achieving prodigies of production. Ford produced his 1 millionth automobile in this same year. Also in 1915, Alexander Graham Bell made the first transcontinental phone call from New York to San Francisco with his trusted colleague, Dr. Watson, on the other end of the line. Motion pictures were really beginning to reshape American entertainment habits, and New Orleans jazz was starting to make an indelible imprint on American music. Also at Sheephead Bay in New York State, there was a new speed record that was set for automobiles that year. with the cars clocking in at a whopping 102.6 miles per hour. A figure, honestly, that many of the aviation enthusiasts of the era would have been beyond thrilled to match. So in the aviation field in the United States, leaders were often finding themselves trailing behind their European counterparts. Yes, the Wright brothers were the first to make a powered airplane flight in 1903 in Kitty Hawk, as most of our license plates tell us. But that feat really didn't receive much attention in American newspapers at all. It actually wasn't until 5 years later, in 1908, when Orville made trial flights for the War Department and Wilbur was making flights overseas that really kind of enthralled Europeans and the European audience. It was only then that some of our American newspapers started to pay them any attention. Aviation enthusiasts in the United States, though, wanted more. At the inaugural meeting of the American Aeronautical Society in 1911, some of its members were discussing the need for a national laboratory with federal funding to support aviation research. A number of organizations, including the Smithsonian, the US Navy, and MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, saw a lot of promise in aviation as a research frontier. The American public, on the other hand, just didn't rally around the cause of aviation. While some saw it as a big mechanical triumph with a significant future, a lot of others just saw it as a fad. They not just saw it as something that would go away, but as something that was super duper dangerous and not really worth the risk. If anything, the antics of the folks who were called birdmen or aviatrixes of the era, they tended to underscore the foolhardiness of airplanes and aviation in general. A flyer, someone flying the plane, they might set a record one month and then fatally crash the next month. Calbraith P. Rogers managed to make the first flight from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast in 1911. It was a 49-day journey, 49 days, and then he actually perished in a crash 4 months later. Harriet Quimby was the first woman to fly across the English Channel in 1912, but then she died in a crash off the Boston coast within 3 months of her return to America. So British, German, and French organizations, on the other hand, grew and developed new technologies, typically with very strong support from both their industry sectors and their government sectors. In 1914, a report issued by researchers working on behalf of the Smithsonian emphasized the vast disparities between the Europeans' progress in aviation and America's relative inertia. This report, of course, coming out in 1914, was coming out against the backdrop of war in Europe. And this is a war, the first war, that was really making use of these new aviation technologies. The use of German dirigibles for long-range bombing of British cities and the rapid evolution of airplanes for reconnaissance and for pursuit, really, underscored the shortcomings of American aviation. We could see what was happening in Europe and knew that that was kind of the new frontier in terms of warfare. Against this background, Charles D. Walcott pushed for legislative action to provide for aeronautical research, allowing the US to try to match progress overseas. Walcott received a lot of support from progressive leaders across the country who viewed government agencies as fundamental supporters of research and saw this work as progressive, consistent with their progressive ideals, things like scientific inquiry, technological progress. But by the spring of 15, the drive for an aeronautical research organization started to gain a little bit of power. That was the year that there was actually legislation to form what was known as the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, N-A-C-A. It was actually attached that year in 1915 as a rider to the Naval Appropriations Bill. So it was a subset of the US Navy. Unlike when a couple of decades later, when NASA was formed, NACA was formed, honestly, without much of anyone really paying it any attention. There was very little notice. It started simply with a chairman. His name was Brigadier General George Scriven. He was chief of the Army Signal Corps. And then he had a committee of 12 people, all white men, of course, representing the government, military, and industry sectors. There was one employee who was dedicated to this group. His name, which I think is a great name for this, was John F. Victory. But these committee members, they, were volunteer committee members. They served only in an advisory capacity. They weren't paid in any way, shape, or form. And they met a few times a year to direct the aim of this new organization. 2 years later, in 1917, construction began in Norfolk, Virginia, on the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory. The formal dedication took place on June 11th, 1920. The inaugural ceremonies included lots of aeronautical exhibitions and a flyover of a large formation of planes led by what they described as the dashing Brigadier General Billy Mitchell. Visitors found that NACA's corner of Langley Field was really small and modest. It was basically, they got an aeronautical wind tunnel, a dynamometer lab, and an administrative building, and then a small warehouse for storing things. Compared to everything else that was at Langley, this was just a corner, a teeny bit. But still, the engineers came to Langley from all across the country. Early employees often had degrees in civil or mechanical engineering, since so few, basically only MIT, offered a degree in aeronautical engineering at this point. By the end of the 1920s, though, that started to shift and change. From a handful of pre-war courses dealing with aeronautical engineering, universities followed the path of MIT and evolved a full plan, a full professional course leading to both undergraduate and graduate degrees in the field. The Daniel Guggenheim Fund for the Promotion of Aeronautics also provided a lot of money to support these kinds of programs at various institutions across the country. So by the time Charles Lindbergh made his solo flight from New York to Paris in 1927, a modest but strong aeronautical infrastructure was already in place here in the US. That said, what was known as the Lindbergh Boom and public interest in aviation, honestly, that brought a lot of people to the topic. That brought a lot of interest to aviation, to the people who were involved in aviation, as well as to what aviation could do, not just for the military, but for life in general. It also led to a lot of folks focusing more on plane design. And by that, I mean not just how well the planes operated, but really what they looked like. The design characteristics from the 1920s were very much a fabric-covered biplane with radial engines. They weren't fancy, they weren't pretty. In the 1930s, we start seeing streamlined shapes and metal construction and retractable landing gear, really things that are aimed at high performance and just visual interest. A lot of these research and advancements were made to benefit military operations, but also a lot were aimed at civilian use. So beginning in the 1930s, on the eve of the Second World War, military aviation work really started to take the focus of NACA. They really shuttled all of the civilian stuff aside. John J. Ide, who manned NACA's listening post in Europe, he reported unusually strong commitments to aeronautical research in both Italy and Germany, where no less than 5 research centers were under development. Germany's largest one, that was located near Berlin, reportedly had over 2,000 personnel at work, compared to the 350 who were at Langley, the only US research facility at that time. And although the fascist powers were developing civilian aircraft, it became really apparent that military research was absorbing the lion's share of work at all of these research centers in Germany and Italy. So in 1936, the agency put together a special committee on the relationship of NACA to national defense in the time of war. This is a group that released a report 2 years later in 1938 that called specifically for expanded facilities in the form of a new laboratory, something that would be focused on military research. And it was an action that was underscored by Charles Lindbergh, who had actually returned from a European tour, warning that Germany had clearly gone far and beyond and surpassed the US in military aviation use and research. A follow-up committee recommended that the new facility should be located on the West Coast, where it would work closely with the growing aircraft industry in both California and Washington state. Following the congressional debate, NACA received money for expanded facilities at Langley in Virginia, as well as with a new laboratory at Moffett Field, south of San Francisco. The official authorization came in August of 1939. And for those of you who are historian folks, you'll know that only a few weeks later, that's when German planes, tanks, and troops invaded Poland. So it's also in this immediate pre-World War II year, with all this ramping up at Langley, with its military aviation focus, that we see women working as human computers coming to work at NACA. Just to give you a little bit of context, the phrase computer actually dates back to the 17th century, when it literally meant someone who could compute, someone who performs mathematical computations. From these earliest days, women were working as computers. In fact, most men saw being a computer to be a temporary job. It was honestly something you would do until something better came along. It wasn't until the 19th century, though, that the idea was really, truly kind of seen as women's work. In the late 19th century, the Harvard College Observatory employed a group of women who you see here in the picture, who collected, studied, and cataloged thousands of images of stars on glass plates. This was a group that was formally known as the Harvard Computers. And one of these women, her name is Wilhelmina Fleming, she was the first to recognize the existence of white dwarf stars. So these are people who are doing lots of scientific research, as well as the actual calculations that drive this work. So computers were hired at NACA on the eve of World War II and continued in this tradition. In 1935, 5 women were hired to read, calculate, and plot data from test in Langley's wind tunnels and research divisions. The first computers at Langley, they were organized into a central office in the main administration building there. They took on calculating work that had originally been done by the engineers themselves. According to a 1942 report, computing sections were designed to process test data more efficiently, relieving engineers of this essential but time-consuming work. A 1942 document on the organization and practice of computing groups at Langley explained that this allowed the engineers to be free to devote their attention to other aspects of research projects, while the computers were receiving praise for calculating data more rapidly and accurately. And this is a direct quote that I love. They were doing more in a morning than an engineer alone could finish in a day. The qualifications required of women who applied to be computers varied, but everyone had to take the civil service exam. In the 1940s, the computers were classified as sub-professionals, which meant they made between $1,440 per year as a junior computer, all the way up to $3,200 per year if you were the chief computer. Most of the women who were hired as computers at Langley had at least a bachelor's degree, and many former computers noted in interviews that the men with similar qualifications were almost always hired as junior engineers, which was a professional classification with a starting salary of $2,600 a year. So working as a computer, despite its sub-professional status, paid a lot better than the majority of jobs that were available to women in the 1940s and 50s. It also provided an entry for women into the field of aeronautical research at a time when most were simply not going to be hired as engineers solely because they were women, regardless of what their background was. It offered one of the very few career options besides teaching for women with degrees in math and sciences. Additionally, unlike many employers at the time, NACA allowed women to continue employment once they were married and even when they were raising a family. In fact, in 1943, they actually opened a daycare facility for the women computers and other women who worked at Langley. While the specific tasks a computer did varied according to whatever department she was working with or whatever the general need was, the majority of computing work, it involved 3 key components: reading film, running calculations, and plotting data. During wind tunnel test, manometer boards measured pressure changes using liquid-filled tubes. The computers would then read the photographic films of the manometer readings and record the data on worksheets. Working individually for a specific engineer, or sometimes collectively as a computer section, the computers then ran different types of calculations to analyze the data, and then they would plot the results on graph paper. All of this work, of course, was done by hand, using slide rules, curves, magnifying glasses, and basic computing machines, which can multiply and calculate square roots and not do much more than that. Once completed, the calculations, graphs, and other information, they were all checked for accuracy and then sent back to the engineers to design the next tests. So why did NACA specifically target women as their human computer hires? As I mentioned, by the early 20th century, computing was thought of as women's work. And honestly, in most cases, computers were assumed to be women. Respected mathematicians would blithely approximate the problem-solving horsepower of a computer machine in girl years and describe a unit of machine labor as equal to 1 kilogirl. The work was seen as secondary to the more important research and engineering work that the men were doing. Of course, also, as I mentioned earlier, women could be hired at a significantly cheaper rate than the men with the exact same educational qualifications. And with few other opportunities of the sort, these women were less likely to move away for greener pastures. Women were also seen as better suited in terms of temperament for detailed and sometimes monotonous work. You would also often see reports that said the women were able to work on a focused project for a more sustained period of time. And also, this is one of my favorite reasons that they gave for hiring women as human computers. Some folks argued that a woman's smaller hands made her more physically adept at rapid fire use of calculating machines. So it was in this environment that Virginia Tucker was hired, along with 5 other women, as the first human computers at NACA in 1935. And there's Virginia Tucker. So Virginia Laden Tucker of Hertford, North Carolina, arrived on our campus, the campus of the North Carolina College for Women, in the fall of 1926. And she quickly established herself as a leader among her peers. In her senior year, she served as the president of the Adelphian Literary Society, as well as the college fire chief. As college fire chief, she organized fire drills, and one that she organized in Spencer Dormitory in April 1930 actually garnered praise from the local chief of the Greensboro Fire Department, who specifically congratulated her on the conduct of the students and the good training that they had had. 2 months after that, in June of 1930, she graduated from North Carolina College for Women with a major in mathematics and a minor in education. After graduation, she actually did work as a high school mathematics teacher in her hometown of Hertford, but she also quickly realized that that was not the path for her, and she took the civil service exam in hopes of applying for a job in the federal government. That's how in September 1935, she found herself as one of the founding members of NACA's computer pool. This pool was modeled on stenographic pools. NACA administrators felt that this group, specifically working as a distinct group, would be able to more efficiently process the growing amount of data that was being produced from research flights and experiments in the wind tunnels. Only 25 women total were on the 300 to 400 person staff at Langley when Tucker and the other new computers arrived in 1935. And all of those other women were primarily in administrative assistant roles. But the number expanded greatly during World War II as men were drafted away for military service. Tucker herself actually helped recruit many of the women who became human computers, traveling to universities and women's colleges across the South to recruit. Administrators at what was, by this point, Women's College, wrote to Tucker and basically, like, this is a direct quote, said, "How many girls do you need?" And Virginia Tucker's response was, "As many as you can send." Tucker worked closely with Langley's personnel director, Melvin Butler, and with engineers such as Eldridge Daring to recruit and train these talented women and to establish computing standards that were used not only at Langley, but also at the new NACA centers in California at Moffett, like I talked about, as well as a new center in Ohio. In 1941, the computing roles, as well as other roles in the defense industry, were open for the first time to African-American applicants. A. Philip Randolph, the leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the largest Black labor union in the country, threatened a massive march on Washington if President Franklin Roosevelt didn't open the lucrative government war jobs to Black Americans. Later that year, Roosevelt signed 2 executive orders, one that ordered the desegregation of the defense industry and one that created the Fair Employment Practices Committee to monitor the national progress of economic inclusion. 2 years later, NACA hired its first group of African-American women human computers, including Dorothy Vaughan, who's pictured here and who was portrayed by Octavia Spencer in the Hidden Figures movie. Back to Virginia Tucker. By 1946, Tucker had actually advanced all the way to the position of overall supervisor for computing at Langley. And she was tasked with managing a department of over 400 women in computing sections across the laboratory facility. She was directly responsible for all women working in East Computing, the central pool of white women, which was located in the administration building. She also oversaw the head computers of other groups, including those located in individual wind tunnels and the all African-American West area computers. But head of the computing pool was pretty much the limit for women at NACA during this time. NACA had no female engineers. Pearl Young was the first and only woman engineer at NACA prior to the 1950s. She had been hired as an engineer in 1922, but resigned that position soon thereafter and was reassigned to be the chief technical editor of their publications. So after 12 years with NACA, with no more opportunities for advancement, Tucker left civil service for a position as an aeronautical engineer at Northrop Corporation in Hawthorne, California. Specifically, Tucker's engineering research focused on boundary layers and increased aircraft efficiency. Essentially, how well does the wind float over the wings? She wrote to the Women's College Alumni Office in 1954 and said, and this is a quote, "My work is most interesting, and I'm privileged to be working with a group of specialists, many of whom have immigrated here from Austria, Switzerland, France, and Germany since 1945. In addition to her work at Northrop, Tucker was a leader in advocating for women in engineering fields. Again, this is in the 1950s. She was elected director of the Los Angeles section of the Society of Women Engineers in 1955. She chaired the Society's National Finance Committee from 1955 to 56. And in 1957, she served as their representative to the LA Technical Societies Council. In October of 1957, she was actually invited to be a principal speaker in a panel discussion at UCLA where they were discussing the women engineer in modern industrial society. During this time, back here in Greensboro, the Women's College also began to expand its curriculum to provide students with more experience in aviation work. In the fall 1946 course catalog, the physics department added a new class to its listings. Elements of Aeronautics allowed WC students to not only understand the principles of aeronautics, but also to actually learn how to fly a plane from instructors at the Hawthorne Flying Service at the Greensboro High Point Airport, now PTI. An article in the Greensboro Daily News noted that, quote, "The course as outlined will be one of the first of its kind in the country, and Women's College will become one of the few girls' schools in the nation to offer flying to its students." The course was led by Dr. Anna Reardon, who was head of the physics department. Prerequisites included at least 1 year of mathematics, 1 year of physics, and written permission from your parents. In the first semester, 7 students signed up for the course. They began with on-campus classes in the science building focused on navigation, aerodynamics, aircraft, meteorology, and air regulations. And they also received specialized instructions on how to read maps, chart courses, and study wind drifts. The classroom learning provided the necessary groundwork for the flying lessons that followed. A minimum of 1 afternoon per week, each member of the class had to catch the Winston-Salem bus from campus to the Greensboro High Point Airport for a half-hour private flying lesson from one of the 4 instructors. An article in the Carolinian student newspaper made special note that, quote, "For flying, the girls wear slacks, blue jeans, or army tans." Initial flying lessons, honestly, focused on being able to fly straight and level, as you would hope it would. As the student newspaper reported, among the most astonishing things to these flyers was running a straight course to discover the plane flying straight at an angle because the wind is blowing. Instead of holding at a steady course down the airstrip on a takeoff, the students go to one side, almost getting off the runway. After managing to master straight and level flying and adjustments to wind drifts, the students then moved on to banks and turns. And by the end of the course, The students demonstrated their skill with pylon 8s, described in the newspaper as ice skating 8s in an airplane with 2 houses as the center of each loop. The Women's College Aviation course disappears from the course bulletin in the 1955-56 academic year, at the time when Virginia Tucker was working at Northrop, serving in the Society of Women Engineers, and advocating for women to enter the aviation engineering field. But in 1965, after 17 years as an engineer at Northrop, Tucker returned home to Hertford, North Carolina, to serve as the supervisor of instruction and evaluation in Perkins County. When she left, Northrop actually had to hire 2 engineers to replace Virginia Tucker and take over her work. Tucker held this position until her retirement in 1974. She passed away 11 years later at the age of 75. Her niece, in a description that makes me very sad that I never got to meet Virginia Tucker, described her Aunt Jenna as her, quote, chatty bourbon drinking, bridge playing, high church, ham cooking, math loving spinster aunt. So as anyone who has seen or read Hidden Figures, as you know, the women computers at NACA and later at NASA continued their important and often underappreciated work long after Virginia Tucker's departure from Langley in 1946. The Bell electronic computer, a huge machine that was acquired by NACA in 1947, had its own computer group that was headed by Sarah Bullock. The women in this computer group were largely in charge of programming the machine, which used punch tapes of data to run calculations for transonic aerodynamic equations. When Christine Darden was hired as a computer in 1967, she had actually already studied computer programming in college. Frustrated by her lack of promotion after 5 years of computing and programming, she transferred over to sonic boom research, eventually earning a PhD in engineering and becoming one of the first permanent engineers, women engineers in supersonic aerodynamics. Darden was actually one of the final human computers to be hired by NASA, as the actual computer machines themselves, what we think of today as computers, became more reliable and more integrated into scientific work. So that's my overview of Virginia Tucker. Like I said, I love Virginia Tucker to death. I think she was a great advocate for women in STEM education, something that is still very important to advocate for now. But you know, I think this is an important piece of history, and I'm happy to turn things over now and answer any questions folks might have about that, or I guess anything else I can help with.
Thank you, Erin. That was wonderful. I know it's hard when you can't see who the attendees are, and I just kind of went at the top of the list. You have several WC grads. We have Agnes Price, Sarah Schaffner, Emmy Mills, Carol Matney, and Mary Lib Slate. I'm going to call out Mary Lib a little bit. Mary Lib, I believe that you mentioned your mom was class of 31. Is that correct? And Sam, are you able to find Mary Lib? And so Mary Lib could share a little bit about that. And then I have a couple of questions that have come in as well. Mary Lib, are you there? And can you unmute? We'd love to hear about that. There you are.
Got me? Yeah.
We got you.
My mother was a 1929 graduate.
29.
And majored in chemistry with a minor in bacteriology, and went straight from Greensboro to Wilmington to live and work in the hospital down there. So she always used that chemistry major. In fact, later she taught chemistry to nursing students when she lived in Raleigh, and was asked to teach some classes at NC State in chemistry. When the men professors were called off to war, she took those classes and stayed there at State until she retired in her late 60s. So she always used that degree and loved the school as much as I did.
Thank you, Mary Lib. I apologize. I got the year wrong. I was thinking
That's
it was
all right.
31.
Well, she would have been there with Virginia Tucker.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, it is such a legacy that she left. And Erin, one of the questions that came in was, Virginia Tucker, it sounds like she applied for the job. And if it hadn't have been for her doing that, then that probably wouldn't have opened up some of these opportunities for other women at WC. Would that be a correct statement?
I don't think that's incorrect. I think having her not just in that role, but as the head computer, I mean, as the head computer, she got to choose where she went to recruit people. And in this field, as well as in some other fields on campus, we have lots of records, particularly from the 30s and 40s, of honestly folks who would just write the faculty members at whether it was North Carolina College for Women or WC, and just say, who do you have who can come take this job? It wasn't even a question of necessarily someone applying for the job so much as Mary Channing Coleman is a person who did that a lot. She was the head of the PE department, and apparently, and we have lots of letters she would get just from, you know, someone at a school in Virginia who says, I need a woman who can teach PE. Who's going to move here? Who are you going to give me? And my understanding is that that was kind of the relationship that was in place, largely because Virginia Tucker had that relationship here. And so, you know, there's also, it's hard, you know, it's hard to guess whether it would have been the same had Virginia Tucker not been in that position, because, you know, you probably would still to come to WC to recruit women computers. But I definitely don't think it hurt.
It never hurts to have connections, right?
Correct.
Someone also asked that you mentioned about her passing in, it was in 1985. And they're wondering, what did she die of? Was she ill? Was she?
I genuinely don't remember.
Okay. Okay.
I got the sneaking suspicion that I never saw anything that necessarily talked about her being ill, but we were able to find an obituary, and I don't think, it's been a couple of years now since I last looked at it. I don't recall it listing the reason.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't seem to have a lot of family left behind. Like I said, she never married, so she never had any kids of her own. You know, there was an interview that I saw, or an article that I saw from a faculty member. It was just a blog post, a faculty member at Georgia Tech who wrote about, she was writing about women computers, and she had an interview, and that's where the quote about her being ham loving and God fearing and bourbon loving came from, was the one niece who lived in Hertford and still had connections with her at the end.
Super. Looks like we have another from attendee, Kristen Gregson. I hope I pronounced that. She said, I grew up in Starr, North Carolina, where my best friend's mother was Ernestine Creech Haxkilo. I'm sure I did not pronounce that correctly. Forgive me. I learned only recently that Ernestine was one of the women computers. So definitely. Chris,
and we still, I was telling you earlier, Mary, I mean, I don't know if any of them are on. I can scroll through all the names and see if I see anything, but we still have WC women who were computers, or like towards the end of the computer era, who are very much still around and kicking. And a lot of them still live in the Norfolk area. Although one I remember told me she had moved to Hawaii, which I was jealous of. But yeah, there are still a good number of WC women who are the legacy from what Virginia Tucker started.
Wonderful. Another question that came in was really about the movie Hidden Figures, and wanted to get your thoughts on, did you feel that that portrayed the reality of what it was like for them? Did you see it? Did you see the movie, Erin?
I saw it, and I read the book too. I will say, if anyone has read the book, you probably noticed the one thing I did, which is when you start reading it, Virginia Tucker's mentioned in the book. They get the name of the college wrong. I was so upset. They mentioned her college twice, and they call it two different things, neither of which is right. At one point, it's the University of North, oh goodness. At one point, it's Greensboro, the Women's College of Greensboro. And I can't remember what the other one was, but I was like,
Wasn't it women's college? Didn't they put it down as women's college? I thought I
They didn't
remember.
get that close. And we frequently, I mean, honestly, as university archivists, I frequently will get, usually about once a month, I get an email from someone who says, my great grandma went to this college, what do you have about her? And inevitably, if I can't find great grandma in our records, I ask if they've gone to Greensboro College, because a lot of people mix the two up, particularly since Greensboro College was a women's college as well. So, but yeah, it was interesting. But yeah, the book, if you've read the book and the movie don't even line up right. And it's, they were developed at the same time. At the same time she was writing, like the book had not been published before they bought the rights to the movie. And I went to an event about 3 years ago where Margot Shetterly, the author, was speaking, and she was talking about that and about how there are certain historical liberties taken to condense people, places, and events in the movie that are for Hollywood purposes, for storytelling purposes. So it's not completely fiction, but it's certainly not a documentary.
That's fair and very diplomatically put. Well, Erin, while we have you here, your historical perspective of women's college is so amazing. As I said, I always learn something every time I sit down and visit with you. I know we're talking about Virginia Tucker today, but what other women from that time come to mind that you love to talk about?
Oh, there are a lot. There are women and men and faculty and staff who, from the earlier eras of the college, that I talk about a lot. I talk about a lot in presentations, in exhibits, but also in classes. We take a lot of this into undergraduate classes. One person who pops to mind immediately, who, Mary, I know you've heard me talking about him, and anybody who's spoken to me for probably more than 2 hours at a, has heard me mention Ezekiel Robinson at some point. Ezekiel Robinson was an African-American man who actually worked at the university from its opening until the late 40s, early 50s. And when he passed away in 1960, he was actually the last surviving member of the original faculty and staff from when we started as state normal. And he's someone who, I don't know how many of you have come to when we could gather in person and we had the Founders Day luncheon. My department creates a little exhibit that's in the back of the room about the founders of campus. And I have subtly snuck Ezekiel Robinson into that story as a founder because he was so instrumental to the opening of the university. And so he's someone who I talk about a lot and talk about as kind of representing all of the faculty or all the staff on campus who don't always get noticed. They do essential work, but often it's without fanfare and without a long-lasting recognition. And so he's someone I definitely like to talk about. But I work a lot with a class that's in Grogan Residential College, which is one of our residential colleges that focuses on, it's the pre-professional residential college. So it's people who are going into one of the professional tracks, so like pre-nursing, pre-music, pre-something. And they actually do a research project every semester that is focused on writing what we call a bio poem. It's a poem we kind of give them this line should be the person's name. This line needs to address where they're from. This line needs to address, what they did. This one is their hopes, hopes and aspirations that you see as represented in the archival materials we have. So we do that a lot. And for that, we do use a lot of records that we have from some really awesome WC era ladies and some of the research we've done there. So one person who I know pops in mind who we use for that is Emily Pryor. She she kind of crosses into two of the paths that we collect on in our department, which is why it's kind of nice to be able to use her. So she was a WC graduate, but also a veteran. And so women veterans is one of our collecting areas. And so we actually, the students will write, one student will have her as their focus of their bio poem. Joanne Smart is another person who, or Drain, who they will focus on. Carolyn Morrison is another one, another vet who was a WC grad. So we were able to bring these things in, and the students are able to use that. And then later in the semester, they kind of have this big showcase of their work. And it's always fun to see how they incorporate the story of not just campus during the 50s and 60s, because that's usually the time period we're focused on, but they're bringing that into thoughts about campus today and reflections on campus today. And so it's a fun way to teach university history, but it's always easier to learn things like that when you're learning it from a person's perspective. It's a lot easier to realize, this is going to sound weird, but it's a lot easier to realize that people 50 years ago were people. It's hard to do that if you're 18 now, to realize that someone in a black and white photo was an actual human being who still exists. It makes it personal for them, and it makes them go, oh yeah, that's an actual person who did these things and was a student just like me, and changed campus in this way, or changed their life, campus changed them in this way. So it's, the stories of people, whether they're, whether it's W.C. Jackson, someone whose name is on a building, or Ezekiel Robinson, or one of our alums, that's a fun thing to do. And I also see the message. Tom Martin is another person who is also often a focus of.
And Tom Martin is on our call today
I saw
as
his
well.
message in the chat. So I told Tom about that before. We had a student who did in an honors college class that I teach who they get to pick whatever topic or person they want to do their final project on. And we had somebody a year ago who focused their project on Tom. And
that is amazing.
And from his time at Curry School through now. And we also weirdly that year also, this would have been fall of 2019. So fall of 2019, a student chose as their topic campus reaction to the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. And her research topic became quickly very popular 2 months later after the semester ended.
Wow.
And now she's a nurse. Now the student who did that is a nursing student who's administering COVID vaccines.
Wow. Well, Erin, I'm sure that our audience is so pleased to hear that students are learning about our history and traditions and legacies. So thank you for helping make that happen. We have a couple more questions for you, and I want to try to get to those. Ann Tate asked, how can I get the information about her time back in Hertford? A classmate, 68, Beth Hurdle Deischer, is from there and might well have known her, being such a small town. Would appreciate getting that info. And that might be a great opportunity for you to share about the new launch of your university archives.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying, if Mary, if you want to connect the two of us via email, I can email over the information that I have, assuming I have access to it right now. I'm obviously not working out of my normal office at this point, but yes, for a lot of information that has to do with university history, just as a teaser, this summer we're actually launching a new website for all of our digitized materials and our digital collections. And so you would be able to go to a website that is easy to use, easy to navigate, and is going to have, and a lot, I'm honestly looking down the list of names. A lot of you have participated in our oral history project at some point over the years. So it's going to have all of our oral history interviews, all of our digitized yearbooks, Carolinians, alumni news, what we call our class of files. So if you're from the class of 1960, you can go to the class of 1960 folder on that website, and you'll be able to see everything from the things you receive, well, at least everything we have, from the things that you first received as a freshman, maybe your like class newsletter, all the way through your commencement program, honestly, all the way through your 50th anniversary, the booklet that is made. And so we're really excited about launching this website. It's going to make it a lot easier for folks to find university history. It's going to make it a lot easier for our students, who are honestly our primary users when it comes to research. We have two key user groups. One is genealogists, who are often alums of the university or children of alums of the university, and then current students. Those are our two main user groups. And so we're very excited about having this new, easier to use, easier to navigate website that's going to be a one-stop shop for lots and lots of information about history from, you know, actually I was going to say from 1891, but we actually have some McKeever things that are older than that. So you can
I can tell you're excited about it.
Yeah,
I can tell you're excited about it. And we get a lot of questions in the alumni office about how to access that information. So we'll make sure that that gets out.
We plan on doing training sessions for you too.
Oh, good. Let's see, our last question that we have that came in the chat, and this kind of goes back to when you were first talking about the history. They want to know, why were the flying classes discontinued?
Honestly, they didn't specifically say. Around that time is when Anna Reardon, who started the classes, retired or left. I believe that's when she left for a period of time. That may have something to do with it, but all we know is that it dropped out of the course bulletin and never popped back up again. And so I'm not sure if it's the instructor changed or the flying school that they were relying on closed. There are lots of reasons that could have been in place at that time. But every time I talk to today's students about that, they ask the same question because they want to go fly a plane as part of the physics class. So yeah, it's not abundantly clear why it was dropped.
It does sound like a wonderful curriculum, I must say. Well, with that, Erin, I want to thank you so much for your presentation today, and for all the knowledge and all the things about WC and UNCG. You're such a treasure to us and our university, and we're just so thankful that you're with us today. And to our audience, I just want to thank each of you for your interest and dedication to attending our Vanguard virtual series. And it's hard to believe this, but the end of the academic year is just about 3 weeks away. I know Erin's kind of, she just taught a class right before this. So, and we're thrilled to tell you that we're going to be able to have in-person commencement, socially distanced, of course. We're going to have several small commencement exercises throughout the 6th and 7th, I believe, of May. And so we're thankful and grateful that we're able to honor our graduates May 21. And we're also inviting all our May 2020 graduates back, and they'll be able to attend an in-person ceremony on that Saturday. So that's great news, and it feels like our world is opening back up. So with the end of the academic year upon us, we'll take a summer break from our Vanguard virtual series, and we'll begin again in September 2021. You all have been such a loyal and dedicated audience, and this has been so much fun. I mean, what a wonderful thing to have an excuse to sit down with some great people and great friends across campus. So again, Erin, thank you. Thank you all to our Vanguard members and more to our attendees. We couldn't have done it without you. We'll do something similar, even if we're back in person. We think this is a great way to connect. So thank you all, and wishing you a great end of the day. Erin, thank you again.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.